Good morning. We'll wait a few seconds for everyone to file in here, but Chris here, and really excited for today. We're going to be doing a beginner live fly tying stream. So for anyone who hasn't tied flies before, for anyone looking to get into it, we're going to be going really from the ground up here. We're going to be taking things really slow, so sorry to disappoint for anyone looking for more advanced stuff, but we're going to take things really slow, go through things step by step and answer your questions kind of as we go along, and tie a few flies. Good morning, superheroes of summer. Good to have you here. We've got a few people already in. Great to see all these early birds. Cool. All right, well, goal here really is just to show you how easy it can be. So we're going to take things, as I say, really slow. What we'll do first, we can sort of jump into it here, and as people file in, they'll figure it out. We'll start with tools and kind of what you're looking for here, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm tying around a camera today. This is going to be a little awkward. We'll see how I fare. But let's switch over here. And you see a fly in there. We're going to take a couple minutes before we actually get on to it. But first, what I want to do is, if you haven't tied a fly before, this is my best example, I think, of just how simple it can be. You don't have to psych yourself out when it comes to this stuff. You can keep it super, super basic. But there are a few things that we're going to need to know regardless of what fly we're tying, and that's really tools of the trade. What are we dealing with? I should say as well, before we really get started, if anyone has questions, please drop them in the chat, and I have my eye on that. I will try to answer them as we go. So, biggest, most central sort of focal point to our tool collection is this guy. It's our vise. It's not too dissimilar from a mechanic's vise. It holds our hook. It's just a very small set of jaws that secures our hook as we tie with it. There's lots of different styles out there. This is a Renzetti. This is my favorite brand, but there are lots of different ones that you can play around with. I'm going to zoom out just a tad here so we can kind of see what we're working with. All right, so as I say, they all might look a little bit different, but a lot of the features will be somewhat similar between models. So basic opening and closing of the jaws, how you're actually going to secure the hook, is with a lever down the bottom. Sometimes it's on the back. Sometimes in the case of a regal, it'll be a lever on the side, but it's usually some sort of a little lever like this that's going to open and close your jaws. On the side, on a Renzetti and a lot of different vices, you'll see a little knob here that you'll see me playing around with. This adjusts the spacing of the jaws. So if you're tying with different size hooks, you can play around with the spacing there to get better grip. This happens to be a rotary vise. A lot of vices are, some aren't. But if it is a rotary vise, that just means that we can turn it. That's handy when we want to see, say, the flip side of a fly. And so we've got a knob on the side here that just loosens and tightens that function there. So if we want to, say, loosen that up, flip things over to see the other side of our fly, and then lock that down, it's stable, it's not going to move around on us. We can firm things up and then loosen it when need be, as we like. To keep it simple, we can just keep it locked up. And that's really about it. There's a couple other features on this vise. This is a fairly fancy vise, but you can certainly do with something a lot more basic. So yeah, those are your basic features. This is the most important one to know down here, is just the opening and closing and the adjustment of the jaws. So pan you back over, show you how we're going to set up our hook in here. I've got here, so we'll start with the finished fly, just to give you something entertaining to look at. This is a little loose for me. If I try and close the jaws around this, it's barely going to hold. That's a really loose hook. That's not something we can tie on. So we need to tighten them up a bit. The way you want to do that, regardless really of what vise it is, if it's a regal, it's really easy because it's just a lever. There's actually no adjustment, but on most vices there is some. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the hook inside the jaws and just tighten them up gradually until the point just before they're touching the sides. You don't want to actually have the hook tight in the jaws at this point, because they're going to tighten up further from here as we close that lever. And if you tighten it up too much, that's an easy way to wear out your jaws prematurely. So I want to tighten it up just until when I start closing the lever, that hook is good and tight. And this shouldn't be too much of a struggle to close at this point. This should be a pretty easy closure. Keeping that hook tight, that'll extend the life of your jaws there. So that's how we get the hook in the vise. Let's put an actual one in. Do it once more for you. Again, I apologize to any more experienced tyers who might be tuning in and being disappointed by how slow we're taking things, but we're really trying to make this a great entry point for people who are just starting, may not know what's up just yet. That's a little crooked. So you'll see what I did there is that hook wasn't perfectly straight in the jaws of my vise, so I just readjusted it quickly. This is the platform, obviously, for our entire fly. If it's slanted or crooked, then our thread's going to be sliding around throughout the process, and that just gets annoying. So you try and make sure this is as level to your table as possible, and that's all you need to do to get the hook in the jaws of the vise. Now I'm going to run over a couple of other tools that you're looking at. First off is this guy. This is your bobbin, or bobbin holder more specifically. Technically, the thing that the thread is on is the bobbin, but most people just call this thing the bobbin. How it works, this is just, it's a thread holder, right? So back in the day, guys used to tie in hand. They actually used to use loose lengths of thread. These days, we have a lot of tools to help us out. This is one of the most handy ones that you can have, and just about every tyer out there these days will be using one. The way you set it up, there's a few different styles, but this is the most common kind with two arms here. That's just going to sandwich the spool of thread. All you do is you spread them apart, and there's holes on the sides of the spool thread. Slide them in so it's held like so. And then what you want to do is get the thread through this little tube, this little neck of the bobbin. So there are different ways of doing that. One, probably the easiest, is a bobbin threader. It looks like this. It's a little tool. It's basically a doubled over piece of wire, or some of them, like Renze makes some disposable ones that are looped pieces of nylon, but same function. All you do is you jam them down the, again, I'm working away from myself here, so this is a little tricky, but you jam it down the neck of the bobbin, out the other end, and now you've got the loop piece of wire down toward the thread spool. So I'm going to do here, I'm going to thread the thread through that loop and draw it back up through. I'll do this off camera because it'll be a little easier for me. There we are. So it's threaded down through that little looped piece of wire, and I'm just going to pull that right back up through the neck of the bobbin. That's the easiest way to do it. The other way to do it would be start the thread into the neck of the bobbin. So just kind of poke the end of the thread into the hole on the bottom, and then actually put the end of this into your mouth and suck it through. That is actually probably the more common way to go. Both work well. The only thing I will say about these guys, especially the metal ones, the Renzetti ones are great because they don't really do anything to your bobbin, but the metal over time can scratch and wear on your bobbin. So actually sucking it through, although it's sometimes not as easy, it does preserve your bobbin for longer. So a couple of ways to go about that. In terms of how this thing actually works, we'll obviously dive into this throughout this episode. We're going to be talking a lot about that. It's pretty simple. One thing I should say is sometimes when you're threading it, because you have loose thread dangling down here, sometimes it'll get twisted around the sides, something like that. It's not the end of the world. All you have to do is pull the thread back and around the side that's looped around. Simple as that. But do try and keep it straight when possible, like so. That just makes it easier to control the amount of tension on your thread. Now, in terms of how this thing works, I should say we should go over which hand you're going to be tying with. So generally speaking, you're going to hold this bobbin with your dominant hand. If you're a right-handed tyer, you're going to hold it with your right hand. That also plays into the direction that your vise is facing. This is a right-handed vise, so all of my adjustment mechanisms here are on the front-facing side for me. If you're a left-handed tyer, this would all be inverted around, so it's facing the other way. So I've got my bobbin here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put in my right hand, and I'm just going to close my hand around that, back it up a little here, just close my hand around that loosely. And by keeping a loose grip, if I need more thread, all I do is I loosen up my grip and I pull on the bobbin, and you can see that dispenses thread nice and smoothly and easy. You don't even have to think about it after a while. Alternatively, if I need a little more tension on my thread, if I'm trying to, say, bind down a more slippery material, I need a little more pressure, all I have to do is with that, again, sort of in the palm of my hand like this, so I can use the palm of my hand to squeeze around the outside of it. I can apply pressure to the outside of the spool and actually lock it up so I can pull real nice and tight. that's as simple as it is. We'll dive into it a little bit more. One word of caution, when you're wrapping, try to hold back here and control the angle and the position of the thread using the front edge of that bobbin, not by grabbing the thread. For whatever reason, I see a lot of beginners, they want to grab the thread. If you're doing that, there's really no purpose for the bobbin. The bobbin's there to make your life easier. Take advantage of that. Great to see we have tons of viewers already. Awesome. Other pair of tools, and we're not going to dive too deep into tools because that's a whole other rabbit hole, but just your basics. Pair of scissors, really obviously quite necessary. A good fine tip, sharp pair of scissors will go a long ways to really making great flies for you. You know, obviously, especially when we're talking about trout flies like this one, we're working on a pretty small scale. And so, you know, your kitchen scissors aren't going to get in there and cut things as cleanly as you need to. A good, you know, near surgical quality pair of scissors is really what we're shooting for here. So, scissors, you know, I think we're all pretty familiar with them. I don't need to dive into those too deeply, but yeah, really crucial tool for sure. And then the last thing, or two things actually I should go over. A whip finisher, and we'll get into how we're going to use these later. We actually have a video coming out later this week specifically on using these guys. Yeah, well, when the time is right, I'll show you how to use these. These are responsible just for basically tying a knot that's going to finish your fly so it doesn't all unravel on you. Got a question. I've seen curved tip scissors before. What would they be used for? Yes, you have, and I've got a pair. Here's a pair right here. So that's a curved pair of scissors. So I've actually got curved jaws. These we're not going to be using today. They have more limited use, I would say, than a straight edge pair of scissors. So focus on the straight edge first. But these are great if you're trying to put a curved shape into something. So I don't have any flies sitting around my desk that actually serve as an example for this, but some flies we're trying to cut some shape into our flies. A great example would be anyone familiar with a muddler minnow. If not, you can search muddler minnow online. You'll get tons of examples, and you'll see it has this kind of curved, beveled head. This is a great way to cut that a little bit more evenly than with a straight edge pair of scissors. That's really it. So yeah, cool tool. As I say, tools you can dive really deep into, and if you have any more questions about tools I haven't covered, I've got a whole desk full of them here, so I can definitely help you out with those. But we're just going to kind of briefly touch on the real essentials. I would say it's really just the four tools that you need. So excluding the vise, the bobbin, the scissors, the whip finisher, and then the last one would be this guy. This is a very basic one by Bodkin. And it is basically a glorified needle. It's just a very long, not crazy sharp, but relatively sharp needle. And this is great for preening materials and you know, applying resins and cements and things like that onto your fly. It's just a good handy tool. Not that you couldn't substitute it with something else, but yeah, these are really handy around the bench as well. And that's really it. That would be what I say is your core group of materials, and we might throw one other in there to surprise you later on with one of these flies, but really you'll see we're going to stick to those. And I think the best tools that you have, and what's really underrated, is these puppies. Just your hands are capable of doing so much, and you know, if you can learn to use your hands effectively, you know, there were some great tyers 100 years ago when we didn't have all these tools, and they may do just fine. I think learning to really control things to the fullest is the best way to go. So you'll see I've pulled a fast one. Yeah, I've actually got another bobbin here. This is loaded with some thread for our first fly. So there are lots, again, we're taking things super slow here, but just to speak a little bit about thread. So there are lots of different threads on the market. Frankly, all the brands work. Our favorite at the shop is Vivas. We just find that it's a really consistent thread. There's Uni, there's UTC, there's tons and tons of brands. And we've tried just maybe not all of them, but a good majority. And we find Vivas is a very consistent one. So that's what we like to use. You'll see me using it here. Of course, you can use others as well. There are different marking systems for the size of thread. I'll grab a couple of spools that are not on bobbins here so you can see better. Let's see. Here we go. This is a good couple of examples. So this is actually the same one I have in my bobbin. This is a 10-aught thread from Vivas. This is just a color code that's not very useful to us, but that's our useful number, 10-aught. This is another spool, also Vivas. This you'll see marked 150D. All right, and those both relate to the size. These happen to be different types of threads. This is a gel spun, which is it's a slippery but very strong thread. This is more of your standard thread, but even non-gel spun threads sometimes are marked with that demarking. So just to clarify what that means, these are two different units of measure. The aught system, frankly, is somewhat arbitrary and does vary between brands. The denier system is a fiber count. So fiber count is very consistent between brands, which is nice. If you wanted to play around with another brand, I don't know why you would, because Vivus is the best thing going, I think. But this is fairly consistent in terms of the fiber count and the thickness of that thread. So basically, higher the number, greater the fibers, thicker it is. The aught system, on the other hand, varies really widely between brands. So Vivus, as I say, is very consistent. You know, throughout their series, if you buy a 10-aught thread, it's a 10-aught thread. You're not going to find variants there. But if you switched brands, say to a Uni, to a Sheer, to Semperfli, anything like that, they also use the aught system. That's the only reason I pull off those examples, is because they also use the aught system off the top of my head. But they vary very widely. The only thing that's common between them is that the lower the number, the larger the thread. So think kind of like hook sizing. A 10-aught thread is thinner than an 8-aught thread, which is thinner than a 6-aught thread, and so on. But a 10-aught in Vivus versus a 10-aught in another brand may be completely different. So you want to keep your eye on that. Without rambling too much, that's kind of the basics of thread sizing. When you're starting out, I would go with something kind of medium heavy. The fly we're going to tie here, I just had some 10-aught in a good color for this fly, so that's what I'm using, but you could definitely go a little bigger. Larger threads are definitely a lot more accommodating for a beginner tyer. To start this, again, we're going to throw that bobbin into our right hand, our dominant hand, and just kind of loosely close our palm around it here, okay? Now the other end, well, I'll refer to as the tag end, I'll hold in my left hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the tag end, I'm going to shorten this up just a little bit here. There we go. Hold the tag end above the hook and the bobbin below on the far side of the hook. So you can see I'm not on the near side, not over here on our side. I'm on the far side of the hook. And for most flies, you want to start near the eye. So very important reference points I think everyone's familiar with. But you have the eye of the hook. You have the shank, which is the entire flat, tieable section. You have the bend that comes around here, and you have the point. And then this is a barbless hook that I'm using here, but if there was a barb, then we might refer to the barb every now and again too. So to recap, tag end above, bobbin below, starting at the eye, and we're going to start wrapping over top of that hook. And the reason I like to orient you in that way is because hopefully you'll start by wrapping in this direction, going from front to back, not back toward yourself. I see it's a tendency of a lot of beginner tyers, for whatever reason. I think it's like a 50-50 chance, because people aren't thinking about how they're going to be wrapping, but a lot of people like wrapping this way, back toward themselves, so fly comes across. That makes it much more difficult in my mind to place materials where you want them. It's not a question of durability of the fly or anything, but it makes things just way more awkward than they have to be. So start on the far side and wrap over the top away. This actually wasn't tightened up quite to where we'd like it. There we go. So, wrap in this direction here. We had a question, Jordan Lewis. Essential materials that beginners should stock that will allow them to tie multiple styles of flies with, for sure. So we are going to sort of cover that. I'm going to tie 4 flies for you today. While we're talking here, what I'm going to be doing, you'll see, is I'm just going to cover the shank with thread, and what I'm doing to achieve that, to try and get a nice even coat, is I'm holding this thread up at an angle, I'm wrapping against it, letting my thread wrap slide down one next to the other, if you can see that. But to go back to Jordan's question there, yeah, we're going to tie 4 different flies today, and I would say a lot of the materials that we are going to use are pretty basic staple materials that you'll find lots of use for. Come in with my scissors here, cut off that tag end. As to the beginner materials that beginners should stock, the flies that we're going to tie today are a little bit more trout, steelhead focused. There'll be a couple flies that you can use for other species too. But I would say it is going to depend largely on what you're planning on tying. Are you a trout angler? Are you a bass angler? It's going to vary, I think, person to person a good bit. So I wouldn't say, you know, these are the materials you must have, but the stuff that we're tying today is pretty basic, so hopefully you'll get a little bit of a sense of what we're working with here. Now this fly is crazy simple. That's the reason I chose it for our first one. This is the Juan Worm, and it is about as simple as it gets. So actually I didn't talk hook too much in this. I just realized I didn't really go over hooks with you guys. I'll cover that in the next fly. But for this fly, it's basically a one material fly, excluding your hook and thread. So this is Ultra Chenille. Chenille usually comes on a card like this. It's kind of like this yarn-like stuff. A lot of time it's like a fiber that's bound between a couple of really small strands of thread and wound tight. It's just like, it's this rope, stringy stuff, however you want to describe it. It's a whole family of materials. There's a million different types of chenille out there. Some come with flash in them. They come in different diameters, different core thicknesses, all sorts of different things. This is what we tie this fly out of. And the reason is that Ultra Chenille doesn't like to strip. So what that means is that if I tie this in, and you'll see on the original fly, we have just loose ends of it dangling off the back. If we tie this fly, after a few fish start chomping away at this thing, the end doesn't come unraveled. It stays pretty solid. I mean, you can strip this stuff if you really try. I mean, I could try and dig in here and maybe, there we go, strip off a little bit of the end, but it takes a lot of force. Whereas a regular chenille, I'll find another one that we're going to use in a different fly. This is a good opportunity to show you guys some of the variants that you find too. This is a Cactus Chenille. We're going to use for a woolly bugger later. And so again, you can see same kind of principle. This is a flashier one, it's a larger one. But if we tied this in loose, so it's hanging off the side, well, these fibers just come right off. They fall off real easy. So that's why we use Ultra Chenille in this particular pattern, is just because it's that really durable, tough material. When you take it off the card, it's been wrapped around this piece of cardboard, usually, and it's got these kinks in it from being wrapped. What I like to do is I just cut. I use those kinks as a marker, and I just cut on them, and then you get a nice. First off, all your flies are the same length. Then also, it's a fairly straight piece. So I've just got a little chunk of this Ultra Chenille in hand here, and what I want to do is I want to kind of center it on top of the hook here, so with an equal amount hanging off either end. And I'm going to show you now how to basically secure material. And this is obviously going to be a very much recurring theme here. So I'm going to place that on top, and I'm going to grip it with my left hand, my off hand, my non-dominant, non-thread hand. All right, I'm going to place it right where I want. In this case, it's on top of the hook. Now to catch that in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up, wrapping in the same direction that I have been with my tying thread, and I'm going to come down with a loose wrap. You'll see this thread is now completely loose. I'm kind of pinching it in between my fingers, and down, and now when I get back to the top, I'm going to tighten here. And now you'll see it, chenille's placed directly on top. And the reason I do that, to show you what would happen otherwise, is if I did the same thing, placed that on top, and wrapped tight with tension, the same way that we were wrapping before this, well, now it torques that material right around. And so now I don't have any control over where that's being placed. I didn't even catch that in that wrap. But by holding that in place, and you'll notice I'm gripping as close to the tie-in point as I can. I'm not gripping way back here, because then it still leaves room for my thread to like jump around. You see how it jumped right to the back of the hook there? Now it's tied off the back. I don't want that. I want to tie it right where I want it, which is about here. Come up, loose wrap, tighten up, and now it's placed right where I want it. So that's called a pinch wrap. That's what we use to secure like 90% of our materials. There's some other techniques out there, but that's sort of your standard way of attaching things to the hook. Glad you're enjoying it, Raph. Thanks for the comment. Now, what we're going to do is we're just going to bind this down the shank of the hook up toward the eye. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take wraps. I'm going to see, you'll see I'm just sort of spacing them out here. So I'm sort of spiraling wraps forward and roughly even turns. And if it gets a little twisted like that, I just pull it back to the top to keep it centered. Get right up to the eye. And now I'm going to make a couple more tight turns. Sorry. And what you'll notice as well while I'm wrapping is I want to keep this leash of thread between my hook and my bobbin relatively short. You know, this is about, you could wrap really short like this, or you could go out, a few inches just down here. But don't, whatever you do, pull out massive amounts of thread, because then if you see, here, let me zoom out a little bit here for you. So I've got this really long leash of thread now. My wraps are really wide. They take forever to make, and they're actually kind of tiring, and I don't have much control, because when I'm way out here, you know, a little change in angle has a big effect on where I'm placing my thread versus, you know, if my thread's right up here, really nice and tight, I have complete control over where I'm placing, and once you get good, you know, you can burn on thread wraps really quick. So keep that thread leash short. You'll see me constantly, if I have a little more thread out than I want, all I have to do is I go down to my bobbin here, and I just roll that right up. I shorten that up. So don't feel like you're locked in. Don't feel like you have to put on all that thread before you get back to a short leash. Just roll the thread up when you need to, and you're good to go. Now that's basically our fly. I'm going to keep things zoomed out a little bit here, and we're going to go over this guy. This is everybody's favorite when they're starting out, not really, the whip finishing tool. And again, we've got video specifically on this coming out, but to give you a little rundown, you can do this two ways. You can do this with the tool. You can do it by hand, which is actually what I like to do. I prefer doing it by hand. But I'm going to show you the tool because I think that's how most people start off. There's also half hitches and other things you can do, but this is sort of the standard. So there's actually different styles of whip finishing tools out there too, but this is the most common. Most of them look like this. What we want to do is these sort of free spin on the handle here. So I find it easiest, start off, grip the actual head of the tool so it doesn't spin on you. Pull out a bunch of thread. I'm going to zoom out even a little further here. And I'm going to place this tool like this on top of my thread. If you can see that. So the hook is going over my thread here. That little hook is going over my thread, and my thread's coming up underneath this little notch here. So I'm just setting it down on top. Now with tension, very important to keep tension, and it doesn't have to be a ton, but just you want this to be taut here. You don't want that to be loose because it'll skip on you. I'm just going to pull my thread off to the side and draw out even a little bit more thread. I'm going to turn this tool. It might be kind of tricky to do on this angle here. I'm going to turn it this direction. So I've gotten back to here. Now I'm going to turn it, keep turning in the same direction until I get to this position. It's sort of like a sideways 4 that I've formed, okay? And what I'm going to do is I can adjust the size and the shape of this to some extent by pulling on my bobbin and pulling up or down on the tool. But while constantly keeping everything nice and taut, I'm going to slide this point where the thread crosses down to the hook, okay? And then I'm going to let the tool turn. So in the same direction as we let our thread turn throughout the entire fly, I'm just holding the handle you'll see now and letting the rotary function do its thing. That's 3 and 4 times around. And then to seat this knot, all I'm going to do is push the tool in until it slips off that back notch. And then I'm going to pull down so that the hook comes right down to the fly. And I'm going to pop that out, and now you're not seated. And that's your fly. That's it. That's as easy as it is. The most daunting part is probably that whip finish. Once you get that down, though, and you can practice that whip finish on a bare hook. It's easy. Once you get down, it's second nature. For the next one, I'll show you how to do it by hand, if anyone's interested. Now, just to finish this up, we've got some head cement here. Head cement is basically, it's a lacquer. It's a very thin lacquer that'll seep into our thread wraps and really secure everything up. You don't have to use this on your flies, but definitely makes them last a little longer. So all I'm going to do, I pop the cap off there. I've got my bodkin, our glorified needle. Oops, bring this back in a little here. I'm just going to dip that needle in. Sometimes these things come with like brush-on applicators or needles in the jar too, but this one didn't. So we've got a little drop, just a very small drop. I'm just going to put on our thread wraps at the head where we tied that knot. Because this fly in particular has a lot of bare thread wraps along the shank, those are all exposed and vulnerable, you can put just a very thin coat, very thin, just over the thread wraps themselves, just to protect them a little bit. But that's it. That is your San Juan worm. Obviously, for anyone who's fished it, really good trout fly, really good steelhead fly. You can fish it for bass, for panfish, wherever you like. That's about as simple as it gets. You don't need to over-complexify things. In fact, I think you know, some of the better tyers I see sometimes are your beginner tyers who really do want to keep things simple. And sometimes the intermediate tyers are the ones who really get carried away, and as they should, because everybody likes to be creative. But you'll see the guys who are a little bit more experienced for their own tying and own fishing go back to basics and really keep things simple, because simple just works, and a lot of time works better than the more complex stuff, frankly. So yeah, don't be afraid to keep it simple. So fly number 1 done. Let's hop on to the next. And as promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about hooks here, because hooks are very important as well. And there are a million out there, and they can be a little daunting. Next fly is going to be a pheasant tail. Very basic fly. Really core staple fly as well. This is a little bit more complex than the last one, so we're graduating here. Both these flies are nymphs. The one that we just tied, this one as well. And so a nymph, for anyone who's been fly fishing for a while, probably knows it's a subsurface insect imitation usually, or worm imitation, whatever it may be. Either way, it's going to be fished subsurface, and it's generally a short profile that these flies have. And so nymph hooks, to put it very simply, are a heavy wire. So they're a thick, heavy gauge wire. That's going to aid them in sinking. And they're a fairly short, what we'd sort of call a standard proportion hook. Now you can get slightly longer, slightly shorter nymph hooks. You can get wide gap hooks. You can get jig hooks. There are tons of variations, but this is one of your core families of hooks. So that's how I like to think about it. I think of there being really 3 families of hooks, generally speaking. So you have nymph or wet fly hooks, which these are. You have streamer hooks. So streamer, what we're going to tie later, as I mentioned, we're going to tie a little woolly bugger. That's a streamer, so it's got a longer shank. These are your leeches, your streamers, things like that. These are longer and generally subsurface as well, so again, a heavy wire. So that's what makes a streamer hook. And again, lots of variations on streamer hooks. There are stinger hooks, there are giant musky hooks and different things. But generally speaking, that's what we're looking at in a streamer hook. Sometimes there'll be short shank ones too, but there are exceptions to every rule. And then what we're not going to be covering today, but the other really family that I think of is dry fly hooks. And dry fly hooks, let's see if I can find a pack here for you. Dry fly hooks are a short shank, because again, we're talking about an insect imitation. But instead of being heavy wire like nymph hooks and streamer hooks, they're a light wire. For obvious reasons, we want, just to give you a comparison here, this is a dry fly hook and a size 12 versus, where'd my nymph hooks go here? Here we go. Versus this is a size 10, so roughly same size nymph hook. You can see the wire difference, right? So this is meant to sink, this is meant to float. Dry fly hooks are very fine wires, so we need minimal materials to keep them afloat on the water surface. So those are sort of your 3 core families of hooks. Again, a million variations between them, but it's worthwhile to think about, what am I tying here and what am I trying to achieve, and just make sure you have the right hook. And we're lucky, most patterns have suggestions readily available online for what you're going to be tying with. Sometimes, if you're going to get a little more creative and try and whip up something of your own, which who doesn't love doing that, you'll need to think it through a little bit more. But they make it easy for us. They usually label these things on the package what they are, so it's pretty easy to follow along. So I've popped my nymph hook back in here. This is a Duhiku 302 number 10. I mentioned I'm tying on barbless hooks. You'll see the one I actually had in the vise, this actually was a barbed hook here. But barbless hooks really are, I think, the best way you can go for trout flies. And the reason is, the other one little point I want to make about hooks is barbed versus barbless models. Actually, I saw a question posted somewhere this morning about barbed versus barbless, so I thought I'd throw my 2 cents in here. Barbed hooks are great if you want to fish it as a barbed hook, but they don't do as well if you're going to crush that barb and fish it as barbless. And we've been taught for years and years, just take your barbed hook, crush the barb in the jaws of your vise or with a pair of pliers, whatever, and make it a barbless hook. And that works okay as far as the regulations are concerned, but as far as how it fishes, the big difference is these hooks are actually designed to be fished barbless. So when the designers are looking at these hooks and when they're making them, they actually take into account the fact that it's going to be a barbless hook, and they put things in their little features to make them more effective for us. Whereas barbed hooks, the same designers are looking at them and thinking, okay, this is going to be fished as a barbed hook. You know, we're not going to worry about those other features because we have the barb to help the angler out. So you do lack on some things, and those things, just to point them out quickly, generally a longer point for one. So barbless hooks, if you look at them, usually this, I'll just nick that in the jaws there so you can see more of this hook. The point is actually longer on most barbless hooks than barbed hooks, and that just makes it a little bit more secure in a fish's mouth. You know, it has longer to go to escape, to pop out on us. The other thing is this inturned point here. So you can see how that point sort of comes up back toward the eye of the hook. That's what we would call a beak point, and that actually sort of acts kind of like a barb. That angle change offers some added resistance to get into a fish's mouth. And the last thing that we're looking at, it's not so much a design aspect of a barbless hook, but more of an issue with crushing a barb, is that when you crush a barb, there's still some residual metal there. A lot of time there's maybe a little bit of a bump, something like that. And having this just be a completely smooth surface offers less resistance when you're trying to penetrate into a fish's mouth, and it just slides in with a lot less force and actually does less damage to the fish's mouth too. So lots of perks with these things. I just wanted to touch on that briefly. If anyone's wondering why bother buying a barbless hook and not just crushing it, apart from the convenience factor, that's it there. They do actually work better, in my mind at least. So you can tie them however you want. That's just another thing to think about when choosing hooks. Again, if you guys have any questions while we're going along, I'm trying to think of all your questions before you type them, but you can throw them down in the chat there and I will answer them as quickly as I can. So we're going to switch threads again. I've got another bobbin here loaded, and this is a great little trick, is just to have all kinds of bobbins loaded, ready to go. This is a 10-aught thread, again, so same size. That's sort of, I would call a 10-aught like a medium thin, like in a Vivus at least. Again, the aught system is sort of all over the place and arbitrary, but I would say 10-aught is great for somebody starting out tying smaller trout flies like these. It's a fairly forgiving thread, but thin enough that's not going to bulk up on you too quickly. If you're tying larger stuff than a 6-aught or an 8-aught, I would say go for that. So we're going to start this same way. I'm going to hold this tag end of thread in my left hand behind the bobbin below the hook, and I'm going to start just wrapping up at the eye, and again bringing wraps down. And I didn't really touch on this in the last fly, but the reason that we do this, that we start up at the eye and we take the thread all the way down when we're just starting at the back anyways, is this is what we refer to as a thread base. And the reason for this thread base is when you buy a hook, when you start tying on a hook, it, you know, out of the package is nicely polished, and they do a really good job of making sure these things are pretty well flawless. Excuse me, pretty well flawless for us. That metal is actually really smooth and quite slippery. And so when you're trying to affix materials directly to that, you know, they can actually slip, and nothing's quite as secure as it could be. So by adding, you know, this little bit of thread, this thread base to our hook, this is actually applying some texture to the hook, and it gives us some added purchase with our materials. So when we're tying things in, it really does lock them down. They don't slide around so easily. So that's the reason for this. It's not just an extra step that I'm taking for the fun of it. It actually does make for a more secure fly. Some guys will even go so far, especially if they're going to be used for some more abusive situations, think saltwater applications, they'll even put a little coat of glue over this just to make sure it really doesn't move. For trout flies, really not necessary, but some guys like to do it for some peace of mind. So as I mentioned, this fly is called the Pheasant Tail Nymph, and it's called that for one pretty obvious reason. It's tied with Pheasant Tail. So Pheasant Tail, going back to Jordan's question there, I believe it was, is one of those materials. If you're a trout fly tyer, this is infinitely versatile stuff. And Ian did a whole talk just on this stuff the other night for us in his live stream. But to go over this, you know, with you very basically, this is, you know, your quintessential pheasant tail based fly, the Pheasant Tail. And I think everybody should have it in their box. It's certainly one of my favorites, steelhead or trout. And so what we're doing, what we're working with on this feather is the individual barbs off the side. These guys, these little fibers. And when you look at a feather, it has three main parts. It has the stem, which is like the stem of a leaf. It has the barbs coming off the side, these little hair things. And then we can't really see it too well on this feather. Some feathers you can see it a little bit more easily, but off of these barbs you actually have barbules. And here's Here's some ostrich. This is a very easy one to see it on. So we have the same construct. We have stem up to the center. You have barbs coming off the side, but you see all these little fuzzy bits on the edges of these ostrich fibers here? Those are barbules, and they're present on every feather. Whether or not you can really see them, that is what's responsible for actually locking a bird's wing together. So that's how they marry, that's how they glue together and stay put, is that those little barbules off the side act kind of like Velcro and stick it all together for them. Not terribly important in this fly. It's useful to know in some flies, but not usually. Usually we're focused stem of the feather and barbs. You'll hear those terms used again and again in various circumstances. So first thing I'm going to do with this fly, this is a little bit more of a complex fly. You'll see I've brought my thread back to the bend of the hook, so just where it starts to curve. That's what we're talking about here. So when somebody says bring it back to the bend, that's what they're talking about. Bring it back to where the hook starts to curve. And I think the biggest mistake people make with pheasant tails, even, I gotta say, the one in the vise there was a little bulky. Keep it sparse, keep it really sparse. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull about, call it 4 of these barbs off the side. You can see 4 of them there. And this is going to be for the tail and the body, actually, if we want. We want to try and make those as nicely lined up as possible. So off the feather, if you look at these barbs, I take a clump like that as an example, you can see how they're all staggered. I've got really, if I tore that off or cut that off, I would have this angled clump. This is way more than we'd ever tie, but just as an example so you can see it. They're all angled like that. And that's not because the length is all that different, that's because the barbs themselves are staggered down the stem, so their placement determines that angle effect. So what we want is we want to try and get a nice square level tail. The easiest way to do that is pull these perpendicular to the stem, and by pulling them up, you can see they're all about the same length and they actually line themselves up. So if we want a nice square tail, that's how you do it. You pull it straight up off of the stem so that those tips are nicely aligned at the top. So going back to this side, this is just kind of my working side. You can see I've been pulling fibers off here already. Those work from the bottom of the feather for this reason, because once we get these 4 barbs, there we go, and pull them perpendicular off so the tips are lined up, I'm going to pull against the grain until they just tear right off. And they'll pull off real nice and easy. It's much cleaner than cutting. You can see I don't have all these little cut ends on this feather. It's all nice and clean. I've just been stripping them straight off. So you work from the bottom of the feather and work toward the tip. That's the easiest way to collect these things. So I've got my tips in hand, right? These are the tips of the clump. These are what we would refer to as the butt ends. We want the tips. And as far as length goes, I think the traditional one is probably more like, half a hook shank length. So you'll see that a lot, is that we tend to measure things in relation to the hook. Proportions are very important when fly tying, because if we find a fly that's great and it really works well for us, we want to be able to replicate that over and over and over again. We don't want to be left guessing, okay, was that 1/8 of an inch long? Was it 1/4 of an inch long? And that doesn't scale well. If I said tie this thing in 1/4 of an inch long, and then this is size 10, I want to tie a size 12 to work out the ratio of length between this size hook and the next down or whatever it may be, is a lot of work. Easier way to do it, measure it up to a portion of the hook shank. So you heard me say half a hook shank length. Well, that's easy to scale no matter what size hook I'm tying on. I like my tails a little bit longer. I'm going to go about a shank length. I like that just because I think it gives the fly a little more motion. So I'm going to go shank length off the back. I'm going to grab it, same way we did the chenille, just off the back, holding really nice and tight to the spot where I want to tie it in. I'm going to come up between my fingers with my thread, just kind of grab that thread, come around, and then tighten up. And again, material's placed right where we want it. Surprise, surprise. I'm going to make a few more tight wraps on this material, coming forward slightly, just to secure things. And then what I'm going to do, as I say, you can use the butt ends here for the body. I find it easier to actually snip them off. If you want, you can actually retie them off the back here. The reason I don't like folding them is you get a weird bump. But you'll see I cut them to about the 2/3 mark on the shank. Keep that in mind, that's important. Now I'm going to tie these tips in. I'm actually going to grab a new clump because this is kind of a larger hook and maybe a little tricky to pull that one off. So I've grabbed, this is another clump of 4, but I just want the full length. And you'll see now I'm tying them in tips forward, so the opposite orientation. And I'm just going to bring my thread back here. Going to put them alongside like so, just catch them in right there. I'm going to pull them in, so I've just barely got them caught by the tips. So I've got the full length of this thing hanging off the back. And then I'm going to take some wraps forward, covering up those butt ends, just to tidy things up, okay? So that's what we're looking at now. And the last material we're going to tie in before advancing is some copper wire. So this is a uni, you can use whatever you like, just a small copper wire on this guy. You can mix up the color if you want to. When I'm working with this stuff, you can cut it. You can actually also, and I might fail miserably here, just break it in your hands. This stuff is actually quite weak, so if you feel comfortable, in the small sizes, the large stuff you have to cut. But small sizes, I find you can just break. Usually I took a few inches there, it's probably about 5 inches, just to be easy to work with. And I'm going to tie this in just on the opposite side of this hook. So I'll give you a view of what I'm doing here. With the wire doesn't like to twist so much, so you don't really have to do the pinch wrap thing if you don't want. A lot of the time it's actually pretty easy to tie in. And you'll see I've actually just pulled it into length. So another way you can do that is if you take the material and you hold it, put it around your thread, and bring it up under your previous wrap, you can position a material really quickly if you like. What I'm going to do is I'll put another wrap on there, and I'm just going to pull this in right to the length that I want, and then I'm going to take my thread wraps back over top of it, back down toward the tail. Like so. And now you can see the reason why I tied in all those materials up to this 2/3 mark, except for this little clump off the back, because I was tying it at such a fine point where those tips taper down. It really didn't affect the taper too much. But I want a nice smooth underbody for this. And the reason for that is when I start wrapping this pheasant tail, and that's what I'm going to do, this long clump of pheasant tail that I tied in, I'm going to start wrapping it. It's going to, the final finished product, the shape of it is going to reflect the shape of this underbody. And so I want to keep a fairly smooth underbody. I want to tie in things the full length of the body so I don't have any lumps and bumps where cut ends were. From here, I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to go forward, and, you know, fairly tight turns, just up to, again, about that 2/3 mark, okay? And then I'm going to start wrapping this pheasant tail. Now, there's 2 ways you can do this. You can do it in the same direction as your thread, or you can do it in the opposite direction of your thread. Because I want to show you guys how to do a cross, reverse wrap with the wire. I'm going to wrap it in the same direction as our thread. So, again, just over the top. I'll be fairly gentle with these things. These fibers aren't the strongest things in the world. So you can see I'm just wrapping forward. Another great little feature, if you do happen to have a rotary vise, is you can actually use the vise to wrap that on as well. It's a little less finicky. It's an option. And then when I get to here, I'm going to tie it off. And we haven't really talked about, you know, wrapping loose materials forward and then tying them off to this point. So you can see I've got these ends of pheasant tail in my hand here. If I were to let go of those, they would spring all over the place and this thing would fall apart. So what I'm going to do to catch them is I'm going to come underneath with my left hand and just bring that thread up so it crosses the loose material there. And once I have a wrap on, I can throw a few more tight wraps on. That's secured now, it's not going anywhere. I can come in and cut off the butt ends. Now you'll see, I did happen to actually just flip this vise over because these butt ends were tied on the bottom. But a really good trick that you can use to avoid ever cutting your thread, because it happens, you know, we're cutting a material and we just nick our thread by accident. That's really annoying. It's not the end of the world if it happens, but it's annoying. Easiest way to do that is if you have the ability, flip your vise over. And now what was the bottom is the top. I've got my materials on the top, my thread on the bottom. I've got near zero risk of cutting anything I don't intend to cut. I can come in and snip that off safely. Even a lot of lower end vices typically have that rotary function. This vise is kind of cool because as I rotate, you'll see things stay pretty well in plane. So everything stays nice and straight, but even lower end vices, which may not have that feature, they'll usually rotate to some extent so you can pull off that little cutting trick. Now the wire. The wire we tie in for two reasons. One, to add a little flash to this fly, a little color, a little segmentation. The other, to reinforce things. This pheasant tail, as I mentioned, is kind of brittle on its own. And so to leave it as is, even a trout's small teeth are going to get in there and they're going to chew it up pretty good. So what we're going to do to reinforce this a little bit is we're going to counter wrap our wire. And all that means is we're going to wrap it against the direction of our thread. So we're not wrapping over the top, we're wrapping back toward ourselves over the top here, and the opposite direction that we wrapped our thread and pheasant tail. And the reason we do that is because now as we wrap, our wire wraps and our pheasant tail wraps crisscross each other. And so they're actually, the wire wraps are staying on top and they're encasing the pheasant tail and keeping fish's teeth from getting in there and chewing things up. That's the reason we do that. Now tie this off. This is the thing. It's a little finicky. It's not that bad, but because we wrapped that in the opposite direction as our thread, if I come over and I try tie that off like I tied off our pheasant tail, the tension on my thread is actually pulling in the opposite direction as the wire, and so by putting wraps on this way, we're going to be loosening the tension on the wire, which is obviously not really what we're shooting for here. So what we want to do is we want to reverse the direction of our thread so that it's pulling the wire tighter. We're pulling the wire in the same way that it was wrapped. And we can't just start wrapping backwards with our thread because then we're going to start taking thread wraps off. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to use the wire as an anchor. I'm going to do this slowly, and I'm going to try and not make this any more complex than it has to be because it's not that hard, but it does seem to confuse people the first time they see it. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take this thread and I'm going to wrap it around the wire once, like so. I'm just putting it over the wire. And now, because the wire is kind of anchoring my thread here, now I can actually start to wrap backwards and not remove previous wraps of thread. So once I've made that one wrap around my wire, now it's secured. Now what I can do is I can start wrapping back over my wire here to lock it in. Wire's kind of slippery stuff, so you want to make a few good tight wraps. Now I don't want to tie the rest of my fly like that because as we already covered, wrapping your thread in that direction is kind of awkward. So what you want to do is you want to just do the same thing in reverse. I'm going to bring the wire around my thread here, right? So I'm anchoring my thread direction again. And now I'm going to start wrapping in the normal direction. I might go around the wire once or twice here just to make sure that's not going to slip on me. And that's it. So it's a little bit of an annoying step. It does result in a more durable fly. The other way that you can do it, which I actually prefer to do, but I did it this way just because I want to show you guys the technique. I think it's a valuable one to know. The other way you can do it is you wrap your pheasant backwards. So the first step you wrap backwards, and because the wire is going to be wrapped over top of it, I'm not so concerned about reversing my thread to secure the pheasant tail. If it gets loosened a little bit because my thread is wrapped the opposite direction as my pheasant tail, it's not the end of the world because my wire is going to be wrapped good and tight over it, and it's going to encase it and solidify everything. So that's the way I actually prefer to do it, but this is a good technique. That's why we did it. Now, to take this wire off, you'll see I'm actually not going to cut it. I'm not going to use my scissors because that wears them down really quick. So you can either have a junk pair of scissors at your bench that you use for wire only, or the easier way to do it, and the cleaner way to do it, is take that wire, grip it nice and close, and start winding it. Nice and wide turns until you stress it and it breaks off. And you'll see that is broken off way closer than I could ever cut it with a pair of scissors, and it saved my scissors. And now I've got a little wire to use for another use, another day. So next material we're going to tie in is, surprise, surprise, pheasant tail again. This fly is very pheasant tail centric. So I'm going to take a little bit of a larger clump this time. Marty, I had it in mind, but believe it or not, this is one of the things I usually show in this class. Hope somebody found it useful. So I'm going to go back to the pheasant tail. I'm going to take a little bit of a larger clump. So whereas last time I took a really thin clump of about 4 fibers, this time I'm going to take a little bit more of a hefty clump. Call it maybe 8 fibers, so about double that. So I'm just approximating this. Maybe I'm not going to bother counting that. I feel like that's 7. I don't know. Yeah, maybe about that. Okay, so it's the same thing. I've pulled that off at a perpendicular angle to the stem, right? And again, I'm just going to pull that against the grain like so. So now I've got a nice little clump pheasant tail with all the tips roughly aligned, like so. I'm going to flip it so the tips are facing forward again. And you can tie this one of two ways. You can tie this fly with legs or without legs. With legs looks cool. I frankly don't know that it really adds much to the fly, but it looks cool. So we're going to do it that way, and it shows you guys one extra technique that you can have in your bag of tricks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie this in. I'm actually going to bring my thread forward a little bit. I tie this fly to the 2/3 mark, but then usually just wrap back slightly over that last rib there. Just so, again, nice flush start point that with no gaps or anything. The length of these tips, I want to go for about 1 times the hook shank length, maybe a tiny bit more if anything. So I've measured that out roughly. I'm going to place it where I want it, facing off the front here. And I'm going to come up, I'm going to make that soft wrap. I'm going to tighten down, coming up, make a couple more tight wraps. And now I'm going to actually, I'm just going to bring my thread forward, pull these down, catch those in at the eye there. I'm trying my best to keep those on top of the shank. So you can see those are centered. They're veiling right over top of the eye, like so. They're not down around the sides or the bottom of the hook. Everything's nice and on top of this hook shank. All right, we're gonna leave that for a sec, and we're going to go to another material. Jordan, if you're listening still, this is another one of those, I would say, must-have materials for most tyers. This is Peacock Curl. Again, more used with trout flies than other stuff, but a very versatile one for a whole host of applications. So these, grab an actual eye here so you can see what we're talking about. This one's a little picked over, but this is a peacock eye. I think we've all seen one before, right? And you've got different types of fibers on this thing, but the herl is basically these fibers on the side here. All right, those are the barbs. And again, you can see the barbules on these things, the little fuzzies on the side. So those are what we're working with here. This is just another way you can buy it. This is a strung, big old hank of them, just plucked, all ready to use. I will say sometimes you find better quality herls on the actual feather, but the strung stuff, frankly, I think works just fine. So I'm gonna pluck out, for this size fly, I've got 3 of them here. This is 3 herls. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so you can see better. Got 3 herls in hand here. Now, oh, yeah, I still do. I thought I lost one. So I'm going to actually align the butts. That's what I'm concerned about on these, because, well, you'll see in a second. So I've got the butts roughly aligned. And what you'll find is that the butts are fairly strong on these things. The tips are not. These little tips are super fragile. They just break with, next to no force. So I don't want to concern myself with wrapping or handling those because it's very easy to screw up and break those off. So what I'm going to do is, now I've lined these things up, and I line the butts up because usually they're intact, but sometimes the tips are broken, so you don't always have a consistent starting point then. I'm going to snip off about the top third of these things. And now I'm working with the bottom third. That's tons of material for me to work with, but it's just going to be stronger and easier overall to work with. So I've snipped those nice and clean. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to catch those in. I'm going to wrap back over those just to the same point that I tied in that nice long clump of pheasant tail there. Just like so. All right. Actually, that's a little further back than one. I started going over the body. You want to try and avoid wrapping over the body as much as possible. Yeah, that's more like it actually right there. Now I'm going to bring my thread back forward. Okay. We're going to take our peacock. Too many P words here. I've got 3 strands here. I'm not going to start wrapping them. Instead, I'm going to take these and I'm going to start twisting them. Let's just give him a little bit of a twist here. And 2 reasons I'm doing this. 1, makes them a little bit more durable, I think, just because you're kind of using the strength of all of their stems. They sort of reinforce each other. And then the other reason is just that it sort of it rounds off the profile of this as you wrap. If you wrap them individually, it's a very flat profile, but if you wind them together like this, like a rope, you get a rounder, fuller profile, which I like for this thorax section. So with those there, I'm going to use the rotary function of my vise because it's a little easier for this step, but you either do that or you just wrap them. I'm going to start at the back here of what we would refer to as the thorax and bring those forward down to the eye. Okay? I'm going to just once again around my thread, catch those in like so, and tie off. That's it. And then I'm going to use that trick again, flip the vise over so that my thread's out of the way, and come in. This is where a good fine tip pair of, of scissors comes in there, and snip those off nice and clean. And you can see at this point in the fly, things are getting tight. The tighter you can cut things, the cleaner the fly is going to be. Actually, I might have nicked my thread there because I wasn't paying attention. My thread slipped, but I'm just going to put a few more wraps on in case that was compromised there. Now, this is where these legs come into play. If you didn't tie in the legs, no worries. Skip this step. But if you did want to try out the leg technique, then this is where it comes in. So I'm going to look at this from top down. I'm going to take my thumbnail and I'm going to push these back over the hook eye. And as I do that, they sort of fan out. And if I give them a little wiggle, you'll see they split over either side. Now it's a little heavier on the left than right, so I'm going to try and even those out a little bit. But generally they do a pretty good job evening out. You can see how those are splayed on either side. Now to keep that splay in place, I'm going to take, this is why I say the leg thing is a little finicky. If you don't want to do that, you just do this long section and don't worry about all this. I'm going to take this longer section and I'm going to pull it over so it comes down between those two clumps of legs and splits them. And I'm just going to, before I do anything else, I'm just going to pull those legs back a little bit more so that they're back on a little bit of a slant out of the way. Okay. I'm going to pull taut over the top. You'll see I'm trying to keep this dead center, this clump of pheasant tail. And I'm going to, again, just take my thread, go up over the top with this pulled taut straight over the back, put a wrap on, and put a couple more securing wraps on after that. And you can see, of course that's going to happen. Perfect, just perfect. I'm sure it'll surprise all of you to know that I don't usually tie like this with a camera between me and the vise about 3 feet away from me. All right, we'll catch those in there. Again, a couple more tight wraps. And so you can see how that creates the effective legs on either side. It's kind of a cool technique. Again, I don't know that the fly actually fishes any better. It actually sinks slower because you're doing this. But optional. It's a cool technique. Now, with those pheasant tail fibers caught in there, what I actually usually do when we're hosting beginner tying classes and I have people doing this for the first time, this can be a little finicky. Maybe what I'm not going to do, but what I usually do is I cut these things short, right down to the base, and then I whip finish. But the trouble there is if anything slips as you try and whip finish, this is going to spring out and it's going to be too short to work with to salvage anything. So you have to backtrack way back and start from scratch, and it's just annoying. So what I would do is cut these down to about that length, maybe a 1/2 inch or so, still extending past the eye. That's going to come off ultimately, but it just adds some security for you while we go back to this guy. Or actually, I said we were going to do this by hand this time, so let's do that. Might even zoom out a little further because this is sort of a wide frame thing that you're going to need to see. Okay, so actually I lost a wrap there. So I'm going to pull out a bunch of thread. The video that we have coming out next week is going to show this a little bit better. This isn't the greatest angle to show you this, so watch that video and you'll get a better sense of it. But I've got 2 fingers on my right hand. I've drawn out just a bunch of thread off my bobbin here. Okay, and this is coming back toward me if that's not clear. I've got 2 hands on my right hand. I'm going to start them out underneath my thread. Okay, so instead of the whip finishing tool that was on top, fingers underneath. Now, I'm constantly, when I do this, pulling backwards slightly with my thread. If I have tension coming forward off the eye, this is a down eye hook, it's slanted down, that thread's going to want to slide down off of the eye and escape. So by pulling back slightly, keep that backwards tension, it's just much less of a chance that anything's going to get away on me here, even if I screw up. Start out with my 2 fingers underneath. Okay, so these are index and middle if that's not clear. And I'm going to turn my hand so I come over the thread. Okay, hopefully it's clear. You'll be able to rewind this on YouTube, so if you need to go back, please do. And I've just turned my palm up. So you can kind of see it's that same kind of shape, you know, that the whip finishing tool has. It's that sideways 4 right here, right? You can see that. And I'll be honest, there are different ways of setting this up. I learned how to do this by trying to emulate my whip finishing tool. I just watched what the whip finishing tool was, and I tried to kind of pull off the same thing with my fingers, and it seems to work well. If you can find another way to do it, go for it. I've seen so many people do this different ways. People are very creative on how to do this. All I'm doing here is I can control the size and shape with my hand. This is part of the reason I like doing it by hand instead of with the tools. It actually offers you a lot of control once you get comfortable with it. But all I'm doing, don't think that I'm rotating my hand like the whip finishing tool was, because we can't turn our hand like that whip finishing tool can endlessly spin. So instead, I think the best way to think of it is I've got a loop of thread in my fingers here, right? All I'm doing is I'm placing the hook eye, right, where we're tying off, inside of the loop. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to move my hand front to back, place that hook eye inside of the loop. Now from here, getting back to the starting position is the struggle. So what we're going to do is I take my middle finger here, and I just move it up next to my index. And you'll see I'm just kind of trying to keep tension the whole time here. That's really, you'll find with fly tying, that is the most important thing, is just thread control and keeping tension on things and having a feel for what that thread's going to do for you. So tension is really key here. I've got my 2 fingers side by side, palm facing me. I'm going to turn my hand over, and at the same time, so now I'm palm down, and bring my hand underneath the bobbin here. I'm just going to bring it back up toward myself, so my palm's facing me, and I'm just going to open up my fingers again. So they were together. I'm just spreading them out now. Very important, keep your index finger on top, middle finger below. Okay, you want to maintain that orientation so that this length of thread up here is always on top and this one's always below. I'm going to take that and same thing, just place that hook eye inside of the loop, fingers together, turn it down, palm down, and bring it back. Ooh, see, things weren't slipping because I was watching the screen instead of my finger placement here. I'm just going to do that quickly again for you. Aha. Okay. I'm screwing up left and right, but this is a great example of why I leave those tag ends long, or especially when teaching beginners how to do this, because that often happens. Things slip, and now you can see it's as simple as just catching that again. I don't know how many times I've actually tied this down, way more than is, I think, appropriate for somebody giving this talk, but either way. We've got that caught back in. You see, it's no big deal. It's a quick fix instead of backtracking all the way. I'm going to do this quickly again while watching my vise instead of the screen. I'm just a mess. Okay. Same thing. Hook eye inside of the loop, fingers together, down and underneath, back to the top. You can see once you get comfortable, it gets to be very fluid. So there's my 4 turns. And now to seat this, because my finger here, I had 2 fingers in here. I just took one out, if you missed that. I've got 1 finger inside the loop. I can bring it down, but I can't really place it as precisely as that little hook on the whip finishing tool. So if you want to be more precise about where this ends up, what you can do, I can swap fingers here if I don't have scissors handy with my left hand. I'm just going to put tips of my scissors or the tips of your bodkin or any fine sort of needle point tool, put them inside there and picked up my bobbin again. And now I can pull down on the bobbin and place that right where I want, like so. Come in, snap off my thread, and now we'll get rid of this scrap stuff. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to pull up hard on it, get out of the way, come in just with the tips of your scissors. Try and cut with the tips of your scissors, not like way back in the jaws. The tips are a lot more precise. And there we go. And when you do it that way, yes, you get a little bit of the butt end still exposed there. Zoom back in here for you. There we go. Yeah, you get a little bit of scrap stuff still exposed. You could throw on another whip finish if you want to clean that up. I don't think it's the end of the world. That is your Pheasant Tail Nymph. There are lots of variations on it, but that is actually not quite the original, but was generally accepted to kind of be the original these days, the most common one at least. And again, we can throw some head cement on there, so same thing. I'm just going to pop open my jar of head cement here. And take my bodkin. Just get a really nice small drop of this stuff on the end of my bodkin. And try and just keep it right on the thread wraps. I'm trying not to get that all over the materials of the fly, because then they get all crusty and stiff on you. So try and keep it just on the thread wraps, just to sort of solidify everything. If you've tied everything right, the rest of the fly is plenty durable without it. All right, so that's, I don't even know if that's really an appropriate next step up from San Juan Worm. That's a big jump, but that's a great beginner fly, and obviously a very productive one. So that's your Pheasant Tail Nymph. Now we'll move on to the third. I've got two more flies I planned for today. One was a hare's ear nymph, one's a woolly bugger. I think just in the interest of mixing things up a little bit, so we aren't just working on the small side, let's do the bugger for this round here. So you'll see this hook is going to look very different. This hook here, this is a size 4. This is pretty big for buggers even. This is a size 4 streamer hook. So you'll see larger profile overall, but even relative to the gap of the hook, a much longer shank. So that's what I was talking about for the different families of hooks. Streamers, generally speaking, have longer shanks just to give us more platform to tie these longer patterns that would generally be your bait fish, your crayfish, your leeches, things like that. So streamer hook, this is a size 4 Dohiku HDS streamer. This is a fly, you could tie this anywhere from, you could tie this really big if you wanted to. There's really almost no limit to it. Down to like a 10, 12 is kind of the comfortable smaller side for things. Jordan, are head cement and UV finishers meant for similar purposes? So yes and no. Depends largely on the type of UV glue that you're using. So you'll see that here, it's probably easiest to see it. This is very watery stuff, this head cement that I have here. I do have several bottles of UV glue sitting around my desk too. You can't see these because they're opaque. If they're clear, then we might have issues with them seizing up on us because these cure, if anyone's not familiar, when exposed to UV light. This one you'll see here, this is a thick formula. So there are thick formulas, there are thin viscosities, there are medium viscosities, and they all have different purposes. The thinner ones, yeah, they can serve sort of as a head cement. I would argue that even in the thinner ones, generally speaking, the actual head cement seeps in a little bit better. I find UV tends to kind of stay on top of the fly. If it's a very good UV, like I think the Solar Res is the best one going, but a very good UV, and Loon's solid stuff too, then it probably offers similar durability. But if I tried to put this thick on, it would just be topical. And so if this ever cracked off, the thread wraps, this stuff really doesn't seep into thread wraps. And so it would just crack off if somehow that happened and leave nothing there. Whereas this seeps in, you can see, to every layer of thread wrap and just really penetrates. The other thing that I'll use very often, you'll see sometimes I'll use, is super glue. Especially like medium or thin viscosity Zap-A-Gap. This stuff is also quite thin. You can see, maybe if you can see that through the bottle, I don't know if you really can. Maybe not, but it's fairly watery. The medium is not quite as watery as that head cement. The thin is. That stuff penetrates really well, so I have no problem using that in place of head cement. Head cement tends to dry clearer, or maybe not clearer, because if you have it over a smooth surface, I say they're both clear. But the super glue, if it gets on materials, if you have a little accident, it tends to end up with like a white crust to it. If it's just a solid glob of super glue, that's one thing. But if it gets into materials, which it often does, it can create a bit of a mess, and it is very noticeable in the final product. Whereas head cement, it just dries clear. It's a no-fuss kind of solution. So they all have different applications slightly. They can all sort of be used for finishing flies, but I think head cement really is the best one for especially these smaller applications where you really want to seep in. So hopefully that helps. All right, big fly here. So we've got that streamer hook going. I'm going to switch things up on us again. This is now a 6/0. So this is the heaviest thread that Vivus makes in their standard lineup. There are power threads and gel spuns, which we won't get into. Those are basically just super strong threads for different applications. But yeah, like we were talking about, lower the number, thicker the thread when it comes to the aught system. And so 6/0 is generally the heaviest you'll find. And this is pretty thick stuff. I wouldn't use this if I wasn't tying streamers. Yeah, don't mind answering those questions at all. Jordan, keep throwing them my way. I'm probably forgetting things as I go here, neglecting to mention things. So if you guys think of anything, please let me know. So I'm going to start this. You'll see again, same way, starting this up at the eye. I'm going to take this down the shank. I'm going to go a little quicker now. And you can see, because I have this short leash here, I can kind of burn down this hook quite quickly. And you'll see there's some little gaps between my thread here. I'm not looking to make perfect touching turns. There's some flies where that can be really beneficial to do. Mostly not fishing flies though, or what I would refer to as fishing flies. If that sounds weird to you guys, like why would he make a fly that doesn't fish? Some guys take a lot of time to make like display quality flies because they're so proud of their skills, and that's great. I do it too, but really doesn't have much use when it comes to our actual fishing applications. So cover my thread cover my hook in thread, and we're going to tie in the tail. And the tail on this guy, this is going to be marabou. Again, Jordan, must-have material. This is one that's very universal. I don't care whether you're a steelhead guy, a bass guy, a saltwater guy, a trout guy, you're going to use marabou almost certainly at some point in your tying career. So this is a good one to have a few colors of, especially the more, well, I shouldn't say more natural stuff. I think more natural stuff usually has more applications than really crazy bright stuff, but you know your situation better than me. So, sorry, I was doing this off camera, but I realized we should really go through this. This stuff, I will zoom out again. This stuff comes in a couple of different sort of types, if you want to think of it that way. So this is what we would refer to as strung quills, strung blood quills. So they're not super long. These are like 4 inches, maybe 5 inches long. These are probably your most commonly used ones. There are also select ones that are like 6 to 8 inches long. They're really big. And there are also what actually would be more ideal for this, but I don't happen to have at my bench, is bugger packs. And bugger marabou is like this really short stuff. It's not very useful for anything else but buggers, but it's got a nice like full profile, and it's short and bushy, and it actually, for this particular purpose, is like the best stuff to use. We just got some in from MFC. It's really nice. But this stuff works. It all works. This is your sort of go-to standard stuff. Anytime that we're dealing with a natural material, and I didn't mention this when we were dealing with peacock and the pheasant tail because they're somewhat consistent usually. But anytime you deal with a natural material, you're going to have natural variation in it, right? Nothing's created equal in nature. And so you do have to kind of look through things and, preen through your packs and find, the quality of material that you're looking for. And, a lot of time guys come into the shop and they ask if they can look through materials, and we're just shocked. Like, of course you can look through materials. Why wouldn't you look through material packs before buying them, within reason? Always, I'd say marabou is one of those things. It's pretty consistent. If you grab a pack, you're going to get similar stuff in everyone. But sometimes, it pays to actually pop these things open in the shop and just take a quick leaf through and find what you like. But what I'm looking for is a feather that looks like this. So you'll see. I'm not too concerned about the overall length because we aren't going to use even close to this whole thing. But what I'm really concerned with is the tips. So this is what I want. I want a really nice dense bunch. I want lots of these little barbs off of here. I want it to be a pretty, if you want to use the word fluffy bunch, then I think that would be an appropriate word. And I want the tips, when you draw them together, to line up like that. So this is a really nice feather that's pretty well undamaged. Some feathers get to be a little bit more ratty, and inevitably in almost every pack you'll find some that look like this. And this is an extreme example, but if you draw this together, that's not quite the same quality. You can see cut ends and broken ends and all sorts of ratty things there. I'm not saying throw these feathers away. There's stuff we can do with these. These actually make for great dubbing. If you have any flies that you can use marabou for a dubbing on, they can offer some really buggy stuff. And I realize we haven't talked about dubbing yet, so that's probably gone over everyone's heads. We will get there, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But very simply, for the bugger application, that is what we like. So a nice dense bunch with nice even tips. And again, proportion is really important with this stuff. So your standard bugger is about a shank length, about that. So same length as the entire flat tieable part of your hook. Now that is a starting point. That's not a hard and fast rule. There aren't a lot of hard and fast rules when it comes to fly tying. Feel free to mix things up. And a lot of guys historically have been very scared of long tails. You'll see me, I like a long tail. So I'm going to actually I'm going to eyeball about 2 times the hook shank length. 1, 2-ish, and around there. There are arguments against the long tail. There's 2 that you'll hear very often. One is that a long tail is going to foul on you. That can happen. It does happen. And what that means is that your tail's, off the back here, and as it gets wet, it gets very soft. And, through the course of fishing, maybe it wraps and, gets pinned underneath the hook as something like that. It doesn't happen often enough that I'm really worried about it, to be honest. I get that there are people who are really concerned about maximizing every cast, as you should be. Maximizing every cast makes a great deal of sense when you're on the river. And so you hate to see when a fly comes back fouled, but I truly don't find that happens often enough to really be a big issue for me. The second argument is short strikes. So I've got, this is my hook here. My hook only goes this far back. I need a fish to eat this for me to hook it. If a tail's hanging way back here, people will say, oh, well, a fish is going to grab this constantly and nip it. This is a streamer. It's going to be moved, usually. You can dead drift a bugger, actually. That was the original way it was intended to be fished. But most guys are going to strip this. And when a fish is chasing this thing down, nipping it isn't always the most practical thing to do. And the other thing that I find is that you definitely get way more motion with a longer tail, and you might miss a few strikes. You might get some short hits, but you're almost guaranteed going to get more hits over the course of a day. So I was listening to another tyer actually the other day, and he made the exact same point as glad to hear is, yeah, there are certain things you can do in tying that might actually cause you some issues throughout a day. Maybe it'll foul. Maybe you're going to miss a few fish, which sucks. None of us want to do it. But if I can, miss even 20% of my takes, which might be on the very high side, if I miss 20% of my fish because of this, and let's say on the extreme side, I got 100% conversion rate on my standard length tail, but I'm getting, double the number of takes, which I actually don't think is an unreasonable number when it comes to the longer tail, because I think you are really getting that much more motion out of it. Say you were hooking 5 fish a day to begin with, so you're getting 5 hits, hooking 5, that's great. Now you're doubling that and getting 10 hits a day, but you're missing 20%, you're missing 2 out of 10, you're still landing 8 fish a day. You can frame it as you like. You can play around with it. This is where you get to play around with things a bit when you're tying. I realize I've been holding this marabou plume on camera for about 5 minutes, and it's probably getting really annoying not doing anything with it. So why don't I do something with it? I'm going to tie in 2 times the hook shank and keep ranting. But this is where you get to really play around with things and alter, little bits to existing patterns and see what works for you. There's, again, no hard and fast rules here. You can experiment till the cows come home and see what you like. So I measured that out to be about 2 times the shank length, and you'll see I've cut that just shy of the eye. So I'm not really going for the 2/3 thing. What I want is like a good hook eye worth of space back here behind my eye. And this is, if anyone struggles with something we call crowding the eye is like when you get to the end of the fly, your thread wraps are building up and getting so bulky that they're overflowing over top and covering up that hook eye and obstructing you from even tying it onto your line. If you struggle with that, this is a good little tip. Make just like a mental barrier, like a wall right here, just a millimeter or 2 back from the hook eye, that you will not tie anything beyond that point. And then you always have some working room, and I challenge anyone to practically be able to build up enough thread in that amount of shank to overflow over the hook eye. That'll save you in the long run from that. Brad, do you ever put a trailer hook on, or can fish see it? I'm not so worried about fish seeing it, but if we're worried about, and again, no rules, play around with it, see what you like. For me, on this particular fly, if one of those 2 core arguments was that this tail might foul and wrap around the hook shank, a trailer hook put back here, right in the marabou, like a hook dangling off the back, is going to get fouled up even more. That's what I can say with some confidence. You could for sure. That trailer hook also might interfere with the action of the marabou though. So the nice thing about marabou, it's super soft in the water and it loves to like flap around as you pull a fly. And a trailer hook, so a rigid piece of wire and a hook back here, is going to interfere with the action of this tail. That's off the top of my head why I probably wouldn't, but nothing's stopping you from it, you know. And if I was swinging this fly, maybe I would. You know, swinging it wouldn't involve the same stripping, and so it wouldn't involve me getting that kind of flap out of the tail. It's a more steady kind of push of water over the tail. It's not moving around as much. Sure, in that case, why not? So I think it's important to consider application, how you're going to use it, and then just play around with it and see if it works. You know, flies are fun to tie, and it's always a good excuse to have more to tie. So, you know, if you want, tie up a whole bunch of variants and see what fish is better, and that's great. What I'm going to do is just quickly bind this down. So I'm going to, what I like to do is just loosely pinch this material and make some open kind of just very loose wraps between. You'll see it's not tidy at all, but I just kind of bound down that loose marabou to the end. And I'm just going to now come back over with slightly tighter wraps just to bind it down. And again, we're tying that in the full length of the shank in this case because we want a nice even underbody that's going to give us a nice even platform for the rest of the fly. Now, I didn't really talk about when it came to pheasant tail, and it actually occurs to me I technically did the pheasant tail backwards, but obviously didn't have an effect. When you're tying in a fly with multiple materials to wrap forward, the best way to do it is to tie them in last to first. Last to first. And what I mean by that is the material that you're going to apply last should be tied on first. So in this case, we have two body materials. One is a hackle that we have here, and one is that Cactus Chenille that I showed you earlier. The reason for that is that as we wrap them, they order themselves so that whatever is being wrapped next goes onto the hook first. You'll see what I mean later, but just to kind of note on that. Now, this is another one of your core materials where I mentioned like chenille is a family of materials in its own right. This is another one, hackles. Hackles, in this case it's the rooster hackle, are any feather that you can wrap, essentially. That's the easiest way to think about it. Somebody else might have a different definition than me, but that's how I think about it. Any feather that I can wrap is a hackle. And so what you'll see, again, if we're thinking that there are three main parts, but really two that we're really focused on a feather, a stem and the barbs, as we wrap it, it has a really cool effect where those barbs, hang on here, see if I can get a little more contrast here. There we go. Hopefully you can see it better. You see those barbs standing up on end up there? That's how you get, you know, this will show up better on the black. That's how you get that leggy effect on a bugger, is a hackle. Rooster or hen, some kind of chicken hackle is the most common, but there are lots of different types. Ostrich, like this is an ostrich plume. This is not a hackle because you can see this stem is like a tree branch. I can't wrap this. This isn't a hackle, but anything with that thinner stem that I can practically wrap around a hook can be a hackle. And that's all we're talking about, is that effect where when we wrap it around, those barbs stand up on end. So that's what I'm referring to here. And this is what we would refer to as a neck. If you think about where this is taken from on the bird, this is the neck of the bird, on the back of the bird. Down from here is the saddle. And then down from there is, if you're talking about a rooster, schlapping feathers off the back. Marabou is, it's actually present on chickens too. This is a turkey feather. This is like the under feather on the bottom of the bird. This is the fluffy worm stuff that it has. The only reason I mention that is that it affects the shape of the hackle. So this being from a neck hackle, it has a very good taper to it. So if you can see, what I'll do is I'll pull the barbs down to stand them up on end, and you'll see the length change. So if you can see, they start off, and some are even more abrupt than this, but they start off much shorter and they get longer progressively. And that, when we're talking about tying, taper is something that you'll hear about quite a bit, especially with streamers, because if you look at minnows or leeches, they have a taper, and what we'd refer to usually as like a teardrop taper. So they start off big and they taper out toward the back. And so by using a neck hackle on this, we can achieve that sort of taper and mimic that effect. No reason you can't use a saddle hackle. In fact, there are some times I'll use saddle hackles on buggers when I know, I'm just going for a bit of a flatter profile. Nothing wrong with that. You can use saddle. But this is a neck. I find the neck hackles are nicer for buggers because you get that taper effect. So use either. This one came off of the actual neck, so it's actually still on the skin. But you can get these things already like plucked off of here in a package too. That's fine too. Whatever you got, that's fine. The important thing again is though, these are natural material, and so they do vary in size and length and quality, and you do want to get a good one. So you'll see, I did kind of preen through here. This neck actually isn't great, to be honest, because of that. There are like a lot of feathers with chunks taken out of them. I can use that for stuff, but if I want to tie a really nice fly, I really don't want that. So the feather that I plucked, for one, has a nice, consistent, evenness to it. There are no real chunks taken out. It's in good shape. That's number one. Number two is you want it to be long enough that you can wrap it down the entire body. So you want a bit of length on it. You don't want, like this is a big hook. I don't want a super tiny feather because then it's going to be really hard to wrap. And then the last thing is I want to focus on the barb length. So ideally, I want it somewhere between like 1.5 to maybe 2 on the longer side. This is probably closer to 2, which I don't mind on the larger fly. 2 times the hook gap length. So this is a rough measurement, but again, this is just another example of how you can use hook proportion to sort of eyeball and measure materials. So what I mean by hook gap is this. It's distance from the point of the hook up to the shank. That's hook gap. So if I just roughly eyeball 1.5 to 2 times, that's roughly 2 times the length of the barbs as the hook gap is wide. And that I'm measuring the longest fibers, not the shortest. I want to measure the longest. That's the longest I want them to be. And you can see another trick I used to kind of eyeball that is I just held the feather by either end and I pulled it up underneath to get those barbs to stand up on the underside of the fly. That's it. That's it. Super easy way to just sort of eyeball and gauge the size of the feather. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie this in by the tip. So I've got the tip just held at the very, very tip end here. I'm going to pull this down. There's another way you can actually tie these in that we covered. I think we actually showed the other way you can tie a woolly bugger in our video on it, but this is the other way. You can either tie it in by the tip first, or you can leave it to the last step and tie it in by the base. Both work fine. I'm just giving you options here. But we're going to expose the very tip end. Okay, so you've noticed I've actually pulled the fibers back away from the tip, so I'm not catching in a whole lot of fibers. I'm just going to catch in at the back. I'll just quickly wrap up and over that and back. I'm going to tie in our chenille. So I'm going to take probably about 4 or 5 inches of this chenille. Just cut it off like so. And now I'm going to do, I already actually cleared off a little bit here, so we'll do that again. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end, I'm going to pluck off some of those fibers at the end, so I'm exposing that thread core of the chenille. And I'm just going to place it alongside and catch it in like so. And the reason we do that is just because it's obviously a thinner diameter material at that point. And so you'll notice I'm not tying that in the full length of the body, I'm just tying it at the back. It's inconsequential in terms of the size of body that you're going to get at the end. It's not going to affect anything if we do that. If we tied it in without stripping some fibers off, we might get some unwanted bulk. So we've got everything tied in. As I mentioned, we tied in our last to apply material first in the hackle and our first in the chenille. And the reason, now going back to that thought, why we're doing that is because now my first to use material is stacked on top. So when I start to wrap it, it's not going to jostle and move any other materials. On this fly, you really only have 2 materials going on here. It wouldn't really matter. You could tie it either orientation, it wouldn't make a difference. But on some flies where you have multiple materials going in, it can be a good idea to keep that in mind and stack them accordingly. So I've wrapped this just up to the eye, and just remember, I've got that little wall there, that imaginary barrier I'm not going to wrap any material past. So with my material held there, I flip my thread over, a few good tight wraps. I'm actually not going to trim that, for a similar reason to why I didn't trim the pheasant tail short. In case I mess up with my hackle and break it or something, I don't want to have to redo everything. So I'm going to grab, again, my hackle now, and I'm going to start wrapping it. As I wrap it, what I'm going to do is just kind of pull these fibers back. And if you want to see how to do like a really clean bugger, I'm going to keep this super simple for you guys, but if you want to see how to do a really clean bugger, I think we go into it a little bit more in depth on our woolly bugger video. As well, we have another video, a technique called folding hackles, and that can be a good one to take into account on this fly as well. But I'm just trying to keep things really basic for you guys. So I'm just wrapping this up. You'll see I'm not making touching turns. I'm spacing out my wraps a bit, making, this is a big hook, 5-6 wraps forward. And then what I like to do is I'll make just another couple of quick wraps at the very head, the very front, so I get a little bit of a denser head to this fly, like so. Same thing, just bring my thread over, catch that, and I'll just come in. And now I'm going to snip off both materials. Only snip off one material at a time. Again, using your scissor tips. Flip over this fly for the hackle. The reason you want to cut one material at a time is it's just easier to get a good clean cut. So again, it just keeps things tidier overall. So we're pretty much there. You can see we've got some kind of stray fibers kicking out here at the eye. It's kind of messy. So what we're going to do is we're going to tidy those up. I'm just going to pull them back and put some thread wraps over top of them, very simply. And this is what we what we refer to as building up a head on a fly. We haven't really talked about that. A head is technically present on every fly, whether we intentionally make it or not. It's just that little ball of thread wraps at the very front. When you have that many thread wraps over top of each other, it kind of reinforces your base thread wraps that initially secured the material, and does a better job of protecting things from fish in the future as you fish the fly, and it also just tidies things up and makes a nice finish. What's the argument for tying beadless versus bead head buggers? Question from Jordan. Is it as simple as gauging the depth of water you'll be fishing? Yes and no. So yeah, we're actually going to, in our next fly, we are going to be tying a bead head fly. So if anyone's not familiar with the concept, we'll be going over that in our final fly. But a bead head is just a lump of like brass or tungsten. Excuse me, I need some coffee here. It's just a lump of brass or tungsten that you could put at the head of a fly. It adds weight. It does help get you down. So bead head can be used in so many different ways. I could do a whole video just arguing bead heads versus no bead heads. It changes the action of the fly. Keep that in mind. So a bead head makes this fly nose heavy. And so when you're, let me just finish this quickly. So I'm going to go back to the tool here, set it up, just because I want to show you guys how this is going to ride if we have a bead head versus beadless. That was a crazy messy cut. I just ripped that thread up. All right, so imagine this had a bead head on it, okay? And do I have a fly with a bead head here? I don't, but these are bead heads. So they're little balls of brass in this case, and you'd put one on the end of a fly. I think most people who have fly fished for a while, might be a shop fly, but you've probably come across a bead head fly before. The reason for it is a couple things. One, as Jordan mentioned, to add weight to help you get deeper. That is totally legitimate. It's absolutely a factor when considering if you want to use them or not. Weightless flies, maybe a little bit easier to cast on a lighter rod. Also a totally legitimate reason why you might want to do that. Weightless flies get thrown around by the current more. So if you're in a river, think of all the current rushing over this fly and pushing it around. It's going to get, just waved all over the place, and even without you stripping it, the current and all, because current isn't even, right? It's broken, and there are different layers of current. A weightless fly is going to get pushed all over the place by that. So that's one argument for a weightless fly. Another one, or an argument, counter argument for the action that you get with a beadhead fly is you get jigging action. So again, think of it as nose heavy. On every pause between your strips, this fly falls nose first, and every strip, it comes up nose first. And so you get this kind of jigging, wobbling action. It's a different look. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, it's just different. So yes, weight, yes, getting down, but also consider that. There's one other final point that I would make is wind. Now, this is kind of a weird argument. This is one that I think a lot of people don't consider. If you are, this is more if you are, say, limited to a bank, maybe fishing a lake, and you have the wind in your face, and you're trying to cast into the wind, a weighted fly will have a lot more momentum going into the wind, and it'll punch through that and straighten more easily. Whereas a weightless fly, similar to how it gets thrown around in the current, is going to get thrown back in your face. So this is a technique we use a lot fishing from the bank and lake environments is, if you have some wind in your face, don't be afraid to throw a beadhead fly on there. Just forget about the action and everything, just for the kick, just for the action that you get in straightening your leader and maximizing your casting distance. So a few different reasons why you might use a beadhead versus non-beadhead. Flash would be another. Again, I could go on, but that, beadhead adds a little flash, it changes the profile of the fly slightly, lots of different things to consider. Those would be your main arguments there. All right, so we got the bully bugger. I won't bother head spinning this one. You guys have seen how to do that over and over. But that is the fly. That is like the fly, again, most of us know that. Most of us have boxes full of these things. I don't care what species you're fishing for. We met a guy in the shop once, I remember, who was an experienced bonefish angler, and he just had a box full of like tan woolly buggers that he fished as shrimp patterns for bonefish, and he killed it on those. So every species loves their buggers. All right. Gonna wrap up on this guy. This is our Hare's ear nymph, and we're gonna tie a beadhead version. This is a non-beadhead version on the Vise. This is probably my favorite trout nymph, I think. And again, a couple variations. Ian did a wonderful session on how to tie a range of different patterns with Hare's ear. This is your most basic one, but I would suggest anyone check that one out because that was really entertaining, really good stuff. Okay, grab some coffee here. I've been going too long. All right, so Hare's ear nymph. It's a buggy nymph. Works great for trout, great for steelhead, good panfish fly. What's great about it versus the pheasant tail is it's a little bit lighter in color. So that can be nice if you want a lighter pattern, but it's also got all this like soft fuzz around it. And so it actually has a lot of motion in the water too. So it's a really just buggy, great fly, especially if you have lots of caddis or scuds or, crane flies, sort of buggy, not so well-defined, lighter colored bugs. It's super productive. You can tie it lots of different ways. So we'll jump into it. We are going to go back to the small stuff here. So find my hooks, find my beads. Here we go. Again, any questions as I'm going through this, throw them down in the chat. We'll get around to answering them. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this so far. I realize this is going to be one of our longer videos, but I really did want to try and slow things down today and really go from the basics. So, number 4. Now, see, I've already skipped a step on you, so we're going to go over this, but just to recap, hook I have in here, this is Dohiku 302. It's like a standard nymph hook. Dohiku is just the brand, and then 302 is the model number in this case, but it's just a nymph hook, so just any sort of nymph hook will work for any of the nymphs that we tied today. And this is size 10. So if you aren't familiar with sizing, I assume everybody is, but making no assumptions. Just a reminder, larger the number, smaller the hook. So a 10 is a lot smaller than that 4 that we just tied on, obviously. The one exception there, just to complicate things even further, is when it's labeled aught, which is like, grab, again, just quickly a hook, because I realized we didn't talk about this earlier. Where are we? Here we go. Here's a saltwater hook. These are real big. But you see how that's labeled 1/0 now? That thing's massive, massive, massive. Hook scale works with the standard labeled numbers. So 1 to 32, higher the number, the smaller the hook, except if it's labeled aught. If you see a marking like this, the larger the number, the larger the hook. It suddenly makes sense. It's like going into the negatives on the regular hook scale side. That would be the one exception, without going too far into that. This is a size 10 nymph hook, all you need to know. And the bead on there is a brass bead and a 1/8 of an inch size. That's what they look like there. This is a regular countersunk bead. And so what a countersunk bead is, it's the most common size bead, and frankly, they aren't even labeled countersunk. They're just labeled beads. So don't freak yourself out if you're in the fly shop and can't find countersunk beads. It's almost every bead, unless labeled otherwise. So if I can show you, this is what it looks like. They've got a hole right through them. There's one side that's a smaller hole than the other. This is really hard to hold up to the camera. There you go. That's the larger hole. So we do another video for what's worth, how to get a bead head onto a fly. And it's a little bit more up close and easier to see. But all we're going to do is we throw the bead head on, point through the hole, through the smaller hole. So you have the larger opening in the back of the bead. Simple as that. You just loop it around the hook. Important to mention, obviously size of bead matters and fitting around the hook. Some hooks just don't like beads. There's some hooks, they have like a really sharp bend in them, and you just can't slide the bead around. So don't get down on yourself that it's just not meant to be with that one. You do have to find ones that can accommodate each other. I will say most standard nymph hooks, most standard streamer hooks, even dry fly hooks, will all accept beads in an appropriate size. It's just when you get into like some of the fancy bends, like caddis bends, egg bends, sometimes it's an issue. We're gonna work with something else here too. This is lead wire. You can work with lead wire, you can work with non-lead wire, you can try doing this without wire at all. But the reason for this is twofold. One is to add some weight to the fly. Lead is quite heavy, it's heavier than brass, but it's also just to secure this bead. So this bead is great to hear you're learning something, Mike. Glad I could help. So this bead is kind of loose on its own, and we can wrap thread and all of our materials behind it and secure it to some extent, but usually it'll still be kind of loose on a countersunk bead or a cone head. If you're tying with, not to confuse things too much, but a slotted bead, which is another style of bead that we're not going to work with today. It's a little bit fancier. Some beads don't really have the big hole in the back. They're a little tighter to the hook. And if the bead's like a really tight fit on the hook, then this may not be necessary. But most beads are pretty loose. And so getting a little wire behind there can really help solidify things for you. So there are different diameters. This is in inches. So this is 15 thousandths of an inch. This is good for like most of your smaller trout nymphs. All right. All we're going to do is we take it, and you'll see I don't have this on a bobbin. You could put this on a bobbin if you wanted to. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this similar to how we started a thread. One end above the hook, one below, and I'm going to make some wraps. And they don't have to be perfectly touching, but you want to try and get them close together. I'm going to make, let's call it 6 wraps on this size. This is a pretty small wire, so let's call it 6 wraps. Now to break off the ends, I'm not going to again cut them. I don't even really have to do the whole winding thing that I did with the copper, because lead is really soft, as anyone who works with it knows, and it breaks really easily. So all I have to do, give it a little wiggle and pull. I realized I covered that up there with my hand, so I'll try and show us better. Just give it a little wiggle and pull. It'll break off nice and clean. And then what I'm going to do, so I've got these lead wraps on my shank here, they're kind of floating around loose. And I've got my bead also floating around loose. I'm going to come up behind those lead wraps and push them into the bead. And now that bead, I mean, I can still move it. I can push it back if I want. But once I get thread wraps on there, those lead wraps pushed into the back of that sort of concave hole in the bead, they're going to really solidify things for us. Okay, so that can be a handy little trick when we're working with the bead heads. I'm going to go back to another bobbin from before. You'll remember this is our 10/0 thread. 10/0, and again, this is just black. Black is, like if you're trying to build a thread collection, black is like the most useful one. White is pretty handy too if you're going to tie lighter stuff like egg flies, but those two you can really live on for most flies. What I'm going to do in this case is I'm not going to start up the eye. Every part of this fly is going to be tied behind the bead head, okay? And to start the thread, I'm actually going to start behind the lead wire here. As I mentioned, that lead wire is kind of free floating still on the hook, and nothing's really secured yet. So what I want to do is I want to lock everything up so that everything is nice and secure. And so I'm going to start by making a few thread wraps behind the lead to try and build up a little bit of a dam to keep it from pushing back. You can see it's a little more secure already. And now I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to wrap over top of the lead wire. Not over the bead, just over the lead. And those thread wraps you can see are sort of sliding between the wraps of lead. Now I'll go back over top, back over a couple times. Now I've really locked things in there. Everything's nice and secure. Nothing's moving around on us. That's as simple as it is. That's adding a bead head. That's how you do it on the woolly bugger that Jordan was asking about before. Yeah, really straightforward stuff. You can throw that on any fly except for maybe a dry fly. I probably wouldn't suggest that on a dry fly, but a nymph, a streamer, a wet fly, whatever you like, go for it. Now things are going to get a little bit more normal. I'm going to start my thread back, a little bit of an angle toward the bend. And you can use different materials for the tail on these things. The original was actually Hare's fur, but you can use this stuff again, the Pheasant Tail. I really like this stuff, frankly, for a tail on a hare's ear. I think it works just fine. It's a different look. You could go with both. Again, this is probably stiffer than the hare's mask hair, so it may not have quite as much motion. So you can take that into account as you will and apply it as you see fit. I'm going to grab, again, a few fibers, 4 or 5 fibers, pull them off at perpendicular angles so you can see it lines up the butts and in turn the tips. And this fly I like with a bit of a shorter tail. I don't really like the long tail. I don't know why. I think most of the motion in this fly comes from the fur on the body of the fly, not the tail. So about half the shank length, just kind of roughly eyeballing that. And just place that off the back end here. Grip it with our left. Loose wrap over. And tighten down. Again, just really focus. Like, I think one of the best exercises that you could practice when starting out, actually might be a little shorter than I actually want. Maybe I lied. Maybe we want it about there. Yeah, sure. Let's do that. That's a little better. Best exercises that you could do, best drills, if you want to refer to it as that you could do when starting out, is just really work on, don't even tie a fly, just wrap. Just wrapping thread and keeping tension. You can see all through my wrap, I don't let it get any closer to the bobbin. I'm pulling outwards. I want outward force on my thread the entire time to keep everything nice and taut. And that gives you more control than you'll get otherwise. Is the most, I think, important skill in fly tying is thread control. Being able to place thread where you want it, when you want it. That's the mark of a good fly tyer. So really practice that. You'll see I've wrapped this pheasant tail down to just behind the lead wire. I'm just going to snip it off there. Because the lead wire has sort of a square edge to it, it has this like drop down. What I like to do is, similar to how I build up a nice smooth body in the other flies, tie all my materials just behind that lead wire to kind of build up a nice even transition from the body to the lead. I'm just going to take my thread back down. And then we're going to tie in our rib. A rib is this stuff. We actually used the copper version before, but we're going to use gold. Gold's the classic. Copper, for what it's worth, works very well on this fly too. No reason I couldn't just reuse that copper wire that we used for the pheasant tail earlier. But this is just a small gold wire. So I'll take off a short length of that as well. You can use a tinsel for this too. Flat tinsel, an oval tinsel, whatever you like. There's lots of different ways of going about it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use that other technique I showed you before, where I just kind of slide it up behind my thread wrap. So you can see I've brought up underneath my previous thread wrap, like so. And then I can just put another wrap on there and kind of pull that in to the length that I want, so I don't have to trim anything. It's nice and easy. So again, I'm just pulling that in to be the length just shy of the lead wire. And then I can wrap over that to bridge that gap, like so. Okay. Take my thread back. And now I'm going to show you one other really key skill, I think, that we haven't covered to this point, which is dubbing. Dubbing is another family of materials. So we have hackle, we have chenilles, we have tinsels, we have bead. These are all families of materials. They aren't specific materials. There are, if you look in the shop, there are walls that we have devoted just to each individual sort of family of material. The other really core key one is dubbing. And dubbing, I think the best way to describe it is fuzz. And I'm working off a mask here, but I'm going to grab a pack of dubbing and show you exactly what I mean. If I can find my dubbings here. There we go. So this is one, if you have watched the Ian stream the other night, he talked about this stuff a lot for probably the majority of the night, and I'm certainly a big fan too. This is the Hare's Ear Plus dubbing. So this is like the prefab version of what we're going to be doing, but and you can use this. This works just fine. Dubbing, the best way I can describe it is fuzz. That's all it is. It can be dryer lint if you want it to be. Now, I would argue there's a lot of better dubbings on the market than dryer lint, but truthfully, that's all we're looking at here is fuzz. It can be made of hares. It can be made of marabou, as I mentioned before. It can be made of synthetics. Lots and lots of different types of fibers that can be used, but that's all it really is. It's just like this fuzzy kind of fiber here. To show you what I'm going to work from is this. This is a hare's mask. So it's like, you know, the actual mask of a hare, and it's got just this really nice dark barred hair on it that we can pluck from, and it gives you a nice spiky look. I just think it's a better dubbing than the prefab stuff for the most part, but you can definitely use the prefab stuff too. It works great, and obviously I've got hundreds of packs of that stuff, and it's great for other applications. All I'm going to do here is I'm going to come in just down around here and around the top of the mask, and I'm going to just sort of pull some hairs out. You can trim them out. There are even like combs out there that are designed to pull this stuff out, but you can see I've just kind of ripped out some hair, and I'm just going to kind of scramble it up in my fingers just roughly, and again, I have just, it's fuzz. There's no other way to describe it, I don't think. That's all it is. But what's really key about dubbing is the way it's used. So there are actually different ways of using dubbing, but the technique dubbing comes from this. We take that fuzz, we put it up against our thread, and between our fingers we roll it. Okay? Don't think of it as twisting it. Twisting in my mind is like this. It's not really doing anything to the material, it's just twisting it. It's just manipulating the position of it, whereas rolling between your fingers mats it. Like so. And what you're doing is almost forming your own little chenille. All right, so there are lots of different types of dubbings out there. As I mentioned, some are finer than others and more suited for, say, dry flies. Some are buggier and better for nymphs. Some are really long fibered and straggly, which are great for streamers, like larger profiles. There are different purposes to each dubbing, but this is sort of at their core what they're meant to be used for, is you roll them between your fingers. Very important, you roll in one direction only. And we have a video on dubbing too, and it goes over this. You do not roll one way and then the other. I mean, it didn't really destroy things there, but it actually did kind of screw them up too. That's an easy way to put dubbing on and take it off in the same step. You keep going in one direction, and further tightening that dubbing to the point where you want it. You may want it really loose on some patterns, you may want it really tight on others. That is as simple as it is. Now this is actually, it's tight around our thread, but it's also loose. We can slide this stuff around. So I can slide that right up against my hook and then start wrapping. And as it's going on, sometimes it'll loosen up a little bit. You can see I can pull down and actually tighten up on that and control the tightness of the dubbing on this fly. So I'm going to go a little further forward here. Like so, to about, again, kind of 2/3 mark on this fly. From here, I'm going to take a wire. Now you can counter rib this. There are guys that would argue you should counter rib it. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I don't think it makes a huge difference. Counter ribbing, it does get the wire to sit more on top of the dubbing and maybe be a little bit more visible, but this doesn't have the same issue as a pheasant tail where it's a durability issue. Hare's ear doesn't get chewed up. I mean, it gets picked out over time by fish, but it's not going to affect the integrity of the fly if a fish picks out a little bit of this fuzz. If it's a little more fuzzy because of that, frankly, I think all the better. So I'm just going to wrap this forward, same direction as my thread. You'll see I'm spacing out these wraps slightly. Probably about 3-4 wraps. Brian, feel. And his question there was, how do you estimate how much dubbing to add? Yeah, feel. Over time, you kind of get used to it. start with a little and build up from there is my best advice. Dubbing in large amounts can be very unruly to work with. Yeah, just break this off as we're talking. Dubbing can be very unruly to work with if it's in large clumps, because it's hard to actually get to mat properly. So start out with a very little bit, and if you have to overlap layers of dubbing to achieve the profile that you're looking for, totally fine. No problem doing that. So yeah, just start light, work up from there. I have a bit of a feel for it at this point in terms of how much it's going to take. You saw there I had to take 2 clumps though, so you know, nothing wrong with doing it in stages. But yeah, start out light. There's also if you'll see in our video, there's dubbing wax, which is like it comes in like the form of a glue stick. Basically, it's this very, very soft wax that can give you more grip with your dubbings to get things even tighter if you want. I generally don't like using that, but that can aid in attaching dubbing if you need a little help with it. In some dubbings, it can be very helpful. Hopefully that helps. Now, we're almost done with this fly. It's a pretty straightforward fly. Frankly, I'll be honest, when I'm tying my fishing flies, I basically just do this up all the way up to the bead, maybe do like a little bit more dubbing at the collar, just behind the bead to give it a little bit profile, and that's it. But in the interest of kind of showing you the original pattern, we're going to tie in a wing case here. So we're going to use, you can use lots of different fibers for this, duck quill, turkey quill, lots of things that are used. I'm just going to use some pheasant tail because I have it here. This is my go-to. I'm going to rip off a decent clump, like a pretty decent clump. I think this fly looks better with a bigger wing case than a smaller one. So again, probably 8 fibers or so. This time I'm really not even all that concerned about keeping things aligned, because I'm not going to be tying the legs or anything. That's the dubbing's job in this case. There is a darker side and a lighter side when it comes to pheasant tail. You'll see the underside of this tail, it's like this dark brown, it has this sheen. The top side has more coloration to it. Most feathers, all feathers have that. And so what I like to do, I want the side with the color to show up on top. So I'm going to tie this, what we call like the bottom side facing upwards, like so. And I'm just going to tie that right on top of the hook again, like so. Okay, so right on top. From Patrick, when you're pumping out your fishing flies, are you still picking off the mask or do you go to the packs? Depends, Patrick. For this fly, I know you were watching Ian's thing the other night, so like the flies that Ian was tying, those are truthfully the versions that I fish for the most part. I will throw a few of these guys for steelhead though, the original ones. I pick off the mask. If you want to expedite things a little bit, you could trim some off the mask, like a lot of production tires. You know, they'll sort of cut off a bunch of hair to start with, mix it up in hand or in a coffee grinder and bag it and just save it for later. I don't think that I'm tying that many that I need to worry about saving that little bit of time. But I think that the mask, it gives you more variegation. It gives you a deeper color range than the pre-blended stuff. The pre-blended stuff, it looks kind of flat to me. Again, there's certain applications where I don't mind it, but generally I think the mask, it just gives you a better color range. So I'm going to cut off the butt ends here. So I'll just come in here, snip those off. I've still got a little bit of space here at the thorax, right? I'm going to go back to our mask, pick off some more hair. And you're going to want a larger thorax section than the abdomen. The abdomen, if you look at bugs, it follows that kind of teardrop taper again. So, you know, larger at the front, thinner at the back. The bead actually does aid in that taper as well, but I want to accentuate that with the dubbing here a little bit. I'm going to dub this on my thread. This is where I say, you know, you can play around with how you dub the dubbing, how you apply it to change the effect that it has. So I'm actually going to dub it fairly loosely here. Very loose. You know, I'm not going for a really tight, what we call dubbing noodle. I'm just getting it just barely to tack to the fly. And I'm going to dub it on really scruffy, loose, and messy. If there's some loose fibers that didn't adhere at all, I can just pluck them off and fold them back into the mix, like so. And you can see that gives us that leg ear, kind of bug ear effect, which I like. I'm going to pull down some of those loose fibers away from the top. And then this is going to be our wing case. I'm just going to fold this over the top and catch that in, same as we did with the pheasant tail. I think that wing case, frankly, again, isn't really necessary. You could argue that, you know, this is, if you aren't familiar with, you know, some basic sort of, mayfly entomology, on their backs they have this little, what we'd call a wing case, where the wings mature and grow as they're in that nymphal stage. And so we emulate that with that little shuck of a pheasant tail off the top. It, I don't know, it kind of blends into the fly for me. I really doubt that it's a thing for fish. If you think it is, go for it. But this fly, I will say, fish is just fine without it. It does look cool though, so I guess that counts for something. So I snip that off nice and tight, and then I'm just going to, again, whip finish up here. I'm going to do it by hand again this time, hopefully a little more smoothly than last. There we go, and again, just switch fingers. Again, sorry, I know you can't see that perfectly. We do have that much better video en route right now. Until then, play around with the tool. And this is that surprise tool I said that I might throw into the mix earlier. This can be really handy as well. This is just a little Velcro brush, a dubbing brush, what we would call it. And it's just, yeah, a little section of Velcro, and it just helps to sort of tease out fibers. So I really like my hare's ears to be really buggy, and all you want to do with this is you just kind of run it over just the front part where you loosely dubbed that dubbing. I'm just pulling these fibers out slightly. And so now you can see that sort of helps the taper along. It also just creates that buggier effect and gives this fly some life, right? Just kind of livens things up a little bit. That's your hare's ear. Again, you can throw a little dab of super glue or head met on there and seal it up a little bit more, but we'll finish it there. And unless there are any other last second questions, that's really all I got for you guys today. We do have lots more videos coming out on YouTube. And a lot of stuff is more beginner focused than not, so feel free to follow along with those and let us know what you think. We do, my suggestion, I don't know if I speak for the entire shop, but this one, if anyone's starting out tying, I would highly recommend choose a fly. I don't care if it's one of these trout flies or if it's a beginner bass fly or what. But just choose a fly and tie lots of them. Tie like a whole pack's worth of hooks in that fly, so like 25 of the same fly, and then move on to the next. Don't overwhelm yourself even trying to tie like these 4 flies back to back. Really, try and get a feel for things and go that way, and repetition is really your friend when it comes to this stuff. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at the shop. We are going to do some more streams coming up. We've got Nick Groves, awesome streamer tyer, coming up next Thursday. We've got Rob, actually, shop owner Rob, next Saturday. He's going to do some popper stuff for us. We've got Ian Troop after that. We've got a whole bunch of really great guests coming on, so please tune in for those. Keep your eyes out for new YouTube videos coming up. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Enjoy your Saturday, guys.